Okay, so next up we're going to talk about wood engraving. So this is similar to wood block, but also a little different. So it's a common method used in the 19th century for book illustration. And this is similar to wood block, but it uses very dense wood. So boxwood is a type of really dense wood that is commonly used for this. Turn up the brightness of my screen a little bit. And it's actually set on end. So you have your block of wood and the grain is running, say, the same, my fingers are the grain of the wood. It's actually set on its end like this. So you're actually carving into the top of the grain of the wood. And that is actually a lot darker. Or not darker, but a lot harder. So it makes it able to make more copies, basically, because it's a harder material that the matrix is being made out of. So they actually could use wood engraving in publishing of large editions of books. So we'll talk about a piece by William Blake, who's an early pioneer of this method. And he illustrated for the book Thornton's Pastorals of Virgil in 1821. And we're going to take a piece of just one of the works that William Blake made called Boy Returning Joyfully with Plow and Oxen. So the fact that he used, sorry, I've been having issues with this. I'm just going to leave it open like this. So the fact that he was able to use wood engraving allowed for a lot of detail. If he would have just used regular woodcut technique, he probably wouldn't have gotten this level of detail, and he definitely wouldn't have gotten very many additions pulled from the same matrix because it would have broken down. So basically this book is kind of a collection of ancient Roman poems that kind of celebrate the rural life, basically. And so this shows Boy returning home joyfully with plow and oxen. We can see some of the herders coming home. The sunset is in the distance, and we see a lot of detail that's possible through the use of engraving tools. And the artist's fine white gouges go with nearly equal ease in all directions, showing the lack of grain in the dense wood that stood upright for carving. And he made the brighter areas, the white areas, by carving deeper gouges, basically. So here he completely carved away. So we're going to talk about Linocut, which is a type of relief. So wood block, wood engraving, and then Linocut are all relief processes. So cutting away at the surface, and the part of the surface that's left is the part that gets inked, and that's where the design comes from. It's a more modern technique, Linocut is, because they're actually using linoleum, which is a synthetic surface. And so they gouge into the areas not intended to take ink, and the inked areas create the decoration on the paper, or the design on the paper. And obviously linoleum is softer than wood, and it has no grain, so it can be cut with a lot more ease and in any direction. So let's take a look at a Linocut. So this is a piece by Elizabeth Catlett. I have special reservations from 1946. It's a Linocut. So this is actually made with linoleum. She's cut away at it, and then she's inked the leftover areas and pressed the paper onto that to create the design. And the large gouges are really typical of this medium. And the strokes also go in every direction, so reflecting the lack of grain in linoleum cut. And this is an example of a socially conscious printmaking piece. So it highlights the issue of race and segregation, which was still practiced when the artist made this print in 1946. So the special reservations of the title refers to the segregation of public transportation that was legal in the United States till 1956. And this is one of a series that Catlett made, that was actually called The Negro Woman. And she attempted to counteract stereotypes by making serious and dignified images of women of her race. So this is an example of an artist using linoleum cut or block printing, which is a relief process, a printmaking process for social change, basically, because it's cheaper, more readily available. She can make a lot of these. They can really get put out there in the public, and the public can really think about this, really think about these issues that she's trying to bring up. So she's really using this medium of printmaking for social change because it has these great characteristics of being easily reproducible and cheap and widely distributable. So we're going to take another look at another piece by Bestabe Romero. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. So contemporary artist in Mexico City. She actually uses tires with the eroded treads, and then she actually carves into the tires patterns that are typically traditional Mexican pop culture motifs, such as skeletons or flowers. And then she inks them, the tires, and then she rolls them out over the top of these long sheets of paper. And she sells them by the yard, or she exhibits them as actual exhibition pieces with the tires themselves. So this is actually kind of neat how she creates these long ribbons with the tire as a material here. Gosh, I keep having to move this around. Sorry, guys. Okay, so Cities on the Move, 2004, tires and relief prints. So 4 prints on domestic fabric. So I think she's actually using maybe a fabric roll here. So it's pretty neat. She sells them by the yard, like I said, or she exhibits them together with the tires that she actually used to print them. So we're going to talk about another process that's completely different than relief printing. So this is another one of those umbrella terms like relief, but it's called Intaglio. And it's different, but it has several processes underneath it that we'll go into with a little bit more detail. But we're going to talk about Intaglio, and it's basically the opposite of relief printing. Areas below the surface hold the ink. And the word intaglio comes from the Italian verb to cut into. So the image to be printed is cut or scratched or etched into a metal surface to make it an intaglio matrix. The printmaker first daubs the plate with printer's ink, then wipes the surface clean, and that leaves the ink in only the etched or grooved portions of the matrix. And then damp paper is used. Damp paper. It's placed on that inked plate, and then they press it under a really heavy weight or roller. And then the print is made on the dampened paper, which picks up the inks in the grooves of the matrix. So it's not the high points like in relief, it's actually the low points. So intaglio is kind of the opposite of relief printing, honestly. Anything that's grooved or etched into a surface is what's printed on the paper, because they actually wipe the ink off, and then the only ink that's left is in the grooves. And actually, because of this, the matrix is reversed on the printing paper, and the pressure of the roller creates a characteristic plate mark around the edges of the image. Sorry, my dog is scratching. So intaglio printing was traditionally done from polished copper plates, but now zinc, steel, aluminum, and even plastic are used. And then there's several different techniques underneath the intaglio process. So there's engraving, drypoint, and etching. And I think they all use metals matrices. So here's kind of an illustration of how intaglio works. So the ink is actually in the grooves of the matrix. So the artist is carving or etching into the surface of the matrix. It's usually metal. And then they put paper here. Here's the paper. And then they use this roller to just roll it down. And that paper gets squished into those grooves that are holding the ink. And that's how intaglio printing works. So the first type of intaglio printing we'll talk about is engraving, and the artist cuts lines into polished surfaces of a metal plate with a burin or engraving tool. And this is a really exacting process that takes a lot of strength and control. And lines are made by pushing the burin into the metal to carve a groove, removing a narrow strip of metal in the process. And a clean line is preferable during this process. And any rough edges of the groove must be smoothed out with a scraper. Darker areas are shaded with various types of cross-hatching. So a successful engraving therefore requires precise smooth lines and parallel lines. And we see a good example of engraving. You can actually look at the United States currency. It's made with the engraving technique. Definitely made by experts. But we're going to take a look at one of Albrecht Dürer's pieces. I believe he's German. The Night, the Death, and the Devil from 1513. This is an engraving. It's not very big. It's 9 5/8 by 7.5 inches. So it's actually quite small. And if you see the level of detail in this thing, considering how small it is, it's really amazing. So we can see the complexity of engraved lines in Albrecht Dürer's engraving The Night, the Death, and the Devil. And there's literally thousands of lines defining the shapes and masses and spaces and values and textures in this complex print. So he's using a lot of cross-hatching. He's using a lot to create value. And the denser the cross-hatching is, the darker the shade or value is in the print. So he's really putting a lot of really dense lines in some of these dark areas. But he's used this technique to create so much detail and mass. I mean, this horse's hind end here, I mean, just look at the value that he's been able to create with this technique of engraving. So there's a lot of really precise, intricate line work here. And so we can see the image of this noble Christian knight moving with resolute commitment, unswayed by the forces of chaos, evil, and death that surround him. So Albrecht Dürer was actually known as a painter, but he is still considered to be one of the most paramount, accomplished printmakers ever. So this piece is really one of his most famous pieces. And actually, I believe he also did some others that were similar to this in style, and they're all really amazing. So Drypoint is another type of intaglio process. It's similar to engraving. So artists use a sharp pointed tool with a steel or diamond tip, and they scratch shallow lines into a copper or zinc plate. And then the displaced metal leaves a burr or kind of a rough edge, similar to the ridge of earth left by a plow. So if you're farming, you're using a plow, it creates a ridge of soil. And the burr catches the ink when it's printed and leaves a slightly blurred line. And because the burr is fragile, it deteriorates rapidly from the pressure of printing press rollers. So Drypoint editions are usually small and are rarely done because they just don't lend themselves very well to very many numbers in the edition, I guess. So here we can see the Drypoint. So those burrs, kind of like the ridge of if you put a plow in the earth, the ridges that might come up of soil. And those are what catches the ink, but they wear down easily, so it's not used very much. So etching, we're going to talk about etching. So this begins with the preparation of a metal plate. The artist paints the surface of the copper or zinc plate with a coating of either wax or varnish, which will resist the acid. And then the artist draws easily into the wax with a pointed tool and exposes the metal with each stroke. And an etching tool can be as thick as a pen, but it's also can be closer to a needle. So a lot of precision can be used with this technique. And then the plate is actually immersed in nitric acid, and the acid bites into the exposed bits of the plate, and then the wax protects other areas of the plate. And so the groove can vary in depth according to the strength of the acid and the length of time it's in the acid. And because they're more freely drawn, etching lines are usually more relaxed or irregular than engraved lines. So there really is a clear visual difference between etching and engraving in the form of the line. So the freedom of line in etching is great. So we'll talk about Christ preaching in the next video, which is in etching.